Welcome, Sally. What a time to be a chief economist at one of the large banks in Australia, and more importantly, Australia's largest financial supporter of rural and regional Australia. Have you ever seen a time in your career that's been more unpredictable or volatile than what we're seeing now?
Hello, Ben. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Well, I think GFC was pretty hairy for a while there. So I started at JP Morgan on the 1st of September 2008, and I remember that really clearly because I think 2 weeks later that was when Lehman Brothers went down, and I remember thinking, oh gosh, what have I done? Joining a US financial institution, but it actually turned out to be the right one to join, so I didn't have too much to worry about. But yeah, that time was incredible because there were a lot happened that we'd never seen before. Central banks and governments reacted in a way that we'd never seen before. So I wouldn't say that what we're seeing at the moment is unprecedented. The world has dealt with oil price shocks in the past. It's just that we haven't really had one quite like this for a while.
And given, I guess, the position with the Middle East at the moment, do you think we've sort of reached peak volatility in relation to that situation? And, if we have, or not, what does the pathway back to normal look like?
So I don't know that you could say for sure whether or not we've reached peak volatility. I mean, there are signs that, I guess if we are to take the comments that have come out of the White House in the last 24 hours at face value, that Trump's told us that the war's close to ending, that he wants to be out of there in 2 weeks. He's making an address to the US nation early our time tomorrow morning. So maybe there are some signs. I mean, certainly equity markets reacted last night like that there is good news on the horizon, and then there were some comments from the Iranians that suggested maybe we're getting closer to some form of resolution or an off-ramp, as people like to say. So I think it would be good if that was the case, but I think the nature of this conflict and the way it's zigzagged, I think tells us that we probably want to be, at best, cautiously optimistic about that prognosis. So we'll wait and see. It would be good if we were at peak volatility and we were closer to the end than the beginning. But in terms of your question around how long is it going to take for things to get back to normal, I think the answer is probably a good 3 to 6 months. And so just some of the lags involved in getting supply moving again, getting it to refineries, and from refineries here to Australia. That's not going to happen overnight. That will take minimum 3 months, probably possibly 6 months to resolve. So I think this is a sort of conflict that is going to have a long tail associated with it. We need to be mindful of that. And we were just chatting over lunch that our own Prime Minister is addressing the nation tonight, and the Financial Review is basically saying he will be telling people that we're, after Easter, going to have to start to ration and make sure that fuel and diesel gets to the people and the industries who need it the most. So sort of think that tells you, and hopefully that's the government being ultra-conservative, and the sooner we start doing that, the better it's going to be, I think, in the long run. But I think that tells you that there's probably not widespread acceptance in Canberra, at least, that this thing's going to be over anytime soon, whether that's the volatility or the lingering impact of it.
And do you expect to see a significant amount of structural change in the Australian economy off the back of this, or will we sort of be back to where we started?
I hope we don't go back to where we started. I think there's a real lesson and an opportunity for all of us in this, which is that, and we had a flavour of it during COVID, where we went from a world where we could assume really regularly that the ships would turn up, that the goods would be delivered onto the docks and then make their way to supermarkets and pharmacies, and we got a little inkling of what can happen when that doesn't go so smoothly, and that wasn't a very nice experience for many Australians. I don't know that we really learnt the lessons from that, and so here we are 5 or 6 years later facing a different set of circumstances but similar implications. And so I think the real lesson in all of this and the real opportunity is one, to embed much more resilience into this economy, and you can think of that as just a form of insurance. And I think in the world that we're in, which we can talk a bit about later, but this is a much more shock-prone world, and this sort of stuff is, I think, increasingly being accepted by a lot of businesses as just a BAU operating environment, that we're not going back to that, relatively low volatility world. We've got to be prepared for, these shocks to come at reasonably regular intervals. And so the big opportunity, I think, for Australia is to sort of take the lesson from this period and from COVID and say, okay, so what are we going to do about that? Like, we're going to have more domestic refining capacity? Are we going to look to become, possibly just more reliant on our own sources of energy rather than bringing them in from offshore? Like, there are lots of different ways we can think about that question, but I think if there's going to be any structural change on the back of this, that's possibly one of them. I guess another one might be, the sort of process of electrification gets accelerated a little bit. So, we've noticed at NAB, I think in our personal lending business, loans for EVs are up 100% in the last week or so. People rushing out to get, to become less reliant on petrol and diesel. So maybe there's an acceleration of that process. So it's possible that there is structural change. Some of it might just happen organically through shifting consumer preferences, but I think the really big stuff's going to happen because the government actually decides that, there's a genuine issue that needs to be addressed here around resiliency.
And we sort of, I guess, talked a little bit about the impact of the Middle East, the Australian economy generally. How are we tracking?
Yeah, so the Australian economy, like sort of pre the Iranian conflict, it was actually interesting because it was quite a unique narrative. The central bank raised rates in February. They did it again in March, and that was at a time when sort of no one else was really doing the same thing. And I think that speaks to a unique set of circumstances for Australia, which really derives all the way back to 2022, 2023, when the Reserve Bank started lifting interest rates and they decided they would take a different strategy to other central banks. So, if you look at our friends in New Zealand, they basically went pretty hard and said, the only way we're going to deal with this post-COVID inflation shock is to put the economy into recession, suffer the consequences, and be confident that we've dealt with the inflation problem. And they did a good job of that, and the economy was sort of really on its knees for a few quarters. In the last year or so, in Australia, the Reserve Bank said, we're not going to do that. And while we didn't quite get the inflation part of our job right, the one thing we did get right was we got to full employment. So if you think about that period after the lockdowns ended, the economy came back really strongly. Pretty much anyone who wanted a job could get one. And so if you think back to, any economics textbook, it'll tell you that that's sort of the holy grail of macroeconomic management. So they said, that's a good thing. And what would be even better is if we could have our cake and eat it. We could bring inflation down, but do that in a way that was gentle, a bit more considered. And if we did it like that, we could maybe minimise the disruption in the labour market, and we could preserve as many of those job gains as possible. So that was their strategy. And they declared victory on that early last year. They said, you know what, actually I think we've nailed it. We've got inflation, it's come down. I think it's heading into that 2 to 3% target band, and actually we've done that when the unemployment rates hovered around sort of the low fours. So gave themselves a pat on the back. That's what you would call a soft landing. They're historically quite rare, so that's good for the RBA. But I think what was underappreciated at the time was that they do bring another set of challenges, and this is where we're a little bit different to everyone else. And those challenges just really reflect this idea that by definition, if you have a soft landing and you don't put lots of people out of work, when the economy starts to pick up speed, as it did in the back half of last year, there's not much spare capacity. There's not a whole pool of unemployed people that you can drag back into the labour force. And so as the economy picked up, we started to hit those capacity constraints, and that manifested in too much demand, not enough supply, and inflation picked up much more quickly than anyone thought, including ourselves, so not just the Reserve Bank. So we started this year with inflation that's too high and actually growth that's too strong, because when you're capacity constrained, you can only really grow at your trend rate of growth, which for us in Australia is in the low twos. And so if you look at the latest GDP number, we finished last year at a growth rate of 2.6, so we're running quite a way above trend at a time when inflation's already too high. And so that was presenting challenges for the Reserve Bank. They had to slow growth. They set about doing that with a couple of rate hikes in February and March. And so I think, even though it might be a simplification, what that tells you is that relative to their peers in other countries, our central bank will have much less tolerance for higher inflation and actually a bit more tolerance for slower growth because they need that outcome. And so there are challenges with that, but I guess one positive around all of this is that the jumping off point to face into the Iranian conflict was a low unemployment rate, so basically full employment, and GDP growth that was actually pretty solid. So that's something which is, I think, a positive. It's the inflation issue that's the challenging part of all of this.
And I guess, Sally, following on from that, you flagged a couple of the structural challenges there. What about, and you just started to talk on one then, what are the opportunities for the Australian economy?
Yeah, so I think there's lots to like. We've got some sort of obviously short-term issues to work through, but I think there's a lot to like about Australia, and certainly, I think global capital is of that view as well. And as if you think about how financial markets have, I guess, performed in the last couple of decades, like really the last 10 to 15 years has been all about the outperformance of particularly US equity markets. And I think going forward, that's more than likely not to continue. And so global capital is starting to say, well, we've had a great run, we've had lots of money invested in the US, but maybe it's time we start to think a bit more broadly about other geographies where we can deploy some of the capital that we need to invest. And Australia stacks up really nicely when you start to think about, well, what are investors looking for? So they're looking for countries that have actually pretty good demographics. And that's one thing that we have here in Australia relative to our peers. So that's a good thing because that anchors long-term growth and it actually anchors long-term real returns on financial assets. So you get a big tick for that. Things that we might have just taken for granted, in the old world, like things like stable democracy, independent central bank, we get ticks for those. That's not stuff that investors take for granted anymore, so that's good. We run a structural budget deficit, which is not ideal. The good thing is it's small, and so that means the stock of outstanding federal government debt is certainly bigger than where it was a decade or two ago, but it's actually quite small compared to what other countries have on their balance sheets. And so what that means is that in times like these, where you get hit by a shock from offshore, our policymakers have capacity to respond. So we can ease fiscal policy, we can ease monetary policy if we have to. That's good. Not every country has that flexibility. So think about the UK and France would be two good examples where it's got a lot of debt and not a lot of capacity to add to that. So that's good. I think we've got the opportunity to be a fast follower in AI. Like we're not at the frontier, that belongs to the US and China, but we can, if we want to, closely observe what takes place in those countries and pivot in the right direction when we need to. So there's that opportunity. But I think the one that's probably the most significant out of all of those, and I think probably the most relevant for everyone in this room, is that we are now in a world where we've basically flipped, right? We used to be in a world where we all committed to free trade, we committed to be sort of good global citizens, we all wanted free movement of goods, capital, labour. That world is over. And we're now in a world where actually what we need to do is put our own interests first. That's how countries are increasingly starting to think. So we care about national security and economic security. And so for a number of countries, and we tend to be a bit like sort of blasé, or, we don't think about this too hard because we're so lucky in Australia in that we have an abundance of hard and soft commodities. But countries like Japan don't have either. And so they are hugely reliant on other countries to trade and to send both energy and food in their direction. So I think in the case of Japan, I read a statistic the other day that said something like 60% of all the calories that are consumed in Japan come from outside. They have to be imported. Now, if you're a government that's sort of looking a little bit inward and trying to think about, well, what do I need to do to protect my country, my economy, my people? Before you do anything else, the two things that you have to ensure is that you have adequate supply of food and also energy, because without either of those two things, you're not going to get much done. And so increasingly, I think some of these big countries are going to look to really want to lock in long-term supply of hard and soft commodities. And the good thing for Australia is that we have a lot of those. And the good thing for the regions is that that's where they are. They're not in the big cities, they're in the regions. And so I think that's the opportunity for Australia over the next decade. And, I've thought for a while now that, even in my old role at JB Weir, when we're thinking about like what's the best way to structure portfolios, we were very much of the view that you've got to have a higher exposure to commodities. So even from a sort of very narrow investment perspective, commodities are attractive, but I think more broadly for the Australian economy, this is going to be a decade or two where everyone's going to want a lot of what we have. And that's just on top of, other things that are going on like remilitarisation, reindustrialisation. They're very commodity intensive, obviously not soft commodities. And then on top of that, there are many countries, particularly the US, but also others, who are desperately trying to get away from China's monopoly over rare earths and critical minerals. And we have the third biggest reserves of those in the world, and so that's another opportunity. So I think we've got a few sort of domestic issues we need to sort out, but if we can get those ticked off, then there's a massive opportunity for us, provided we play our cards correctly.
No, some really, really interesting stuff in that, Sally, and I do want to come back to the point about the independence of the Reserve Bank or the central bank. You mentioned a couple of things there in relation to agriculture and how Australia is well positioned. What have we got to do from an economic sense to make sure that we capitalise on that, in terms of those points that you just made?
So I think we've got to make sure that the things that you need, like capital and labour, get to the regions, and that is an issue, right? And so, we need the people there to build the houses so that more people can come and work there. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg story. But, one of the great things about this role is being able to go all around the country. And, I've done a few trips in the last year with Khan, and, we've mostly in regional New South Wales, up in the northwest, southwest. Those regions are incredibly productive, incredibly vibrant, but even when you go there and just chatting to someone in Moree, he sort of said, oh yeah, well, even if it's clearly no shortage of land, but even if I wanted to get a house built, it's a 2-year wait before I can get that done. And another one of our customers who is a property developer down in Albury saying, even for a basic development where there's no environmental issues, all we're building is houses, so there's remotely, not at all controversial, an 18-month wait to get that through the local council. Like that sort of stuff we've got to fix up. But I think that's probably, from my sort of more big picture understanding of the issues, is it's really the supply of capital, but particularly labour into regional Australia.
I've got a couple more questions for Sally, but she very kindly offered to take some questions from the floor. So I've got a few more for you. Then we might hand over to the troops to see what they would like to hear from you. I think let's get the obvious one out of the way. Interest rates over the next sort of 12, 24 months. What's the House view on that?
Yeah, so this is becoming a bit more tricky. Like I think we were reasonably confident pre-Iran that we were on the right track with rates. So the forecast as it stands today is that they're going to go one more time in May, and then that'll be that. But we've got to start from a point where, from the Reserve Bank's perspective, inflation's too high, and it was already too high in February, but now it's going even higher. So that's a problem. And so the way they think about that is to say, well, the only way we're going to get it down and back into that target band and have it stay there, because remember, they thought they'd got it there, and then it just kicked back up again. So they've got to get it there and keep it there. They have to slow growth. And so pre the Middle East conflict, that was all just going to happen through higher interest rates. Now it's going to happen not just through higher rates, but also because there's a shock to real incomes. So households are having to spend more on their petrol bill, and so they can't spend as much on discretionary spending. And likewise, businesses are spending more on their fuel bill, whether that's sort of petrol or diesel, and so their margins are getting squeezed as well. So the oil shock will slow growth as well. And then the trick to all of this is trying to work out how much of each of those things is going to do for you. Is rates going to do a bit and oil going to do a bit, and together that gets you enough, or we'll all give you a bit and we have to go a bit further on rates? It's very, very difficult to calibrate. And one of the key sort of drivers and the fundamental thing around all of this is just how long it lasts for, because that that helps you sort of quantify the shock. So I would not like to be sitting at the Reserve Bank trying to work out which, how much all those different things are worth. There are so many different moving parts to this. But for now, we have a view that they will go again in May. We hold that view with much less conviction today than we might have done, 4 or 5 weeks ago. And that's, I think, in my job, it is the job of my team to put forecasts down on paper. That's what we do. But I think we also have to be, really honest with our customers and say, we've got to be pretty humble about those forecasts, like best endeavours, but really, they've got fat tails either side of them, and, our conviction in them is not as high as we would ordinarily like, just simply because, things are moving so rapidly.
And I guess, to summarise that, and so, we're a bit of a colloquial term, but we're in a bit of a suck it and see time in the economy. And look, you sort of see what's happening in the US and how that's playing out. And I'm really interested in your view in terms of that administration and that leader. The way that administration is being run now, what are you guys expecting will be, Trump moves on and we go back to normal, versus how much of this stuff will we see change for good?
Mm-hmm. So when Trump moves on, we will get less noise, less volatility, I suspect, a bit more rigour and discipline to policy making, so less chaos, so that will be a good thing. But I don't think we're going back to where we were before, and so, one of the stronger views that we do have, which I think is being borne out, almost weekly in terms of the way things are playing out, is that we're not in that old world that we talked about before of free trade and free movement of goods, capital and labour. We're in a new world where we look after ourselves first, and then we think about, dealing with the rest of the world. And so this is why you will see countries use what we call economic statecraft. So that's all the things that we've been hearing about: tariffs, export controls, sanctions, to basically get those objectives for their country. Governments are going to be far more involved in allocating resources and capital across economies. So think about all the companies that the Trump administration has taken stakes in, highly unusual. Here in Australia, we haven't done that on such a scale, but we have Future Made in Australia. That's one part of the government being far more involved in the economy. And we're also seeing the government backstopping things like the Whyalla Steelworks and the aluminium smelter in New South Wales. And they're not doing it because they've got nothing better to do with the money. They're doing it because they're taking the view that in this world we need sovereign capability in steel manufacturing and aluminium manufacturing as well, right? So governments are starting to say, actually, there's a much bigger role for us to play in the economy, because we've got to ensure that we have capability in some really strategic areas. Likewise in critical minerals, they're really hard to dig out of the ground, they're really messy to process, the prices can be really volatile, and so governments are now starting to say, actually, we will effectively commit to a floor for the price. Maybe we'll do some outtakes as well. We'll commit to always buying a particular part of what you produce. So these are all sort of ways of governments getting involved to ensure that particular industries prosper. So you've almost got to go back to the 70s to see policy like that. That's what we used to call industrial policy. Now we're doing it in the interests of sovereign capability, national security. So this is the new way of thinking about economies, organising economies, very, very different to what we used to think. And so, it's interesting watching politicians, because there are some, I think, who really get that and sort of say, actually, we've got to move on. But there are others who want to get sort of pulled back towards that neoliberal way of viewing the world, where it's just all about free trade. And it's tempting to do that as an Australian, because that world was really kind to us. That worked really well for us as a small open economy with a lot to export. So this whole notion that we all just focus on our comparative advantage. So as Australians, we'll dig lots of stuff out of the ground, we'll send it offshore. That's what we're really good at. That's what we've got a lot of. And then we'll rely on everyone else to send us the stuff that we don't make here. That model doesn't work in this new world, because by its very definition, you are just highly dependent on all sorts of people for, quite important goods and services. And so that doesn't work in a world that's far more fractured, and far more disrupted.
And so I think at the start of that answer, Sally, it sounded like it was good for Australia.
Yeah, it is.
It is, but even with your comments at the end there, fundamentally, this sort of change will be better for our economy over the longer term.
I think if we grab the opportunity with both hands, and so this is where we get back to the whole commodities story, right? Because other countries are thinking in similar fashion, thinking, okay, so what don't we have, and what do we need to secure supply of? And so, I think there are many countries who want a lot of what we have, and they have stuff that we've got no capability in. So think about Japan and Korea, like both exceptionally good at really high-end manufacturing, both exceptionally desperate for food and energy. I'm sounding like President Trump now, but there's a deal to be done there.
Yeah, say this sounds
I don't
like
want to. I don't think I'd ever say that. Deal. But I think that increasingly, like, we're going to move towards, far more strategic bilateral trading relationships rather than just saying, here's what we've got, put your bid in and we'll sell, type sort of thing.
So that, I guess that ability to negotiate, and so our leadership then becomes very important, because they will be the people responsible for, I guess, leading that important part of our economy.
Yep, precisely. So I think there's it might take a while to gestate and to grow, but I think over time, when we look at how the US is behaving, when we look at how the Europeans are starting to shift as well, after the Munich Security Conference last year, where JD Vance basically said, like, we're done, we're not really interested in NATO anymore. Once they sort of picked themselves up from the floor and started to think about, well, what does this mean for us as a region? All of a sudden, the Germans far more willing to spend money on infrastructure defence. The Europeans, set up a pan-national defence fund, and the idea is that it buys as much from European manufacturers as it possibly can. So, each sort of region or country is really starting to say, well, I've got to put my own economic interests first before I start worrying about anyone else. And I think, we have to, as Australians, start to think a bit more like that as well.
Now, I've got one more question for you, Sally, and then we'll hand over to the floor. But there's a little bit of a left field one. So if you could be God for a day, or whichever one you believe in, if it isn't God, and you could make 3 changes to the way the Australian economy operates, what would you do, and why are they important?
Okay, so there's a few that need to be done. We've got to sort out energy policy. Like, that's super important. At the end of the day, economic activity is just energy transformed. And so, as we've been talking about, we're a country that's abundant in energy. We should be a low-cost energy producer. That's a massive advantage compared to other countries, and we've done a really good job of screwing that up. Okay, so that would be number 1. Number 2, we've got to do proper tax reform. I don't think it's not good enough just to fiddle at the margin with maybe a little bit of reform on CGT, maybe a little bit of reform on super. We're to take a wholesale look at the taxation system and acknowledge we tax income too much, and fix that up. That needs to be done, and that's really important for ensuring. Taxation is all about sort of effectively incentives, and we're going to need, as our population ages, even though we've got relatively good demographics, we've still got an ageing population. We're going to need people to keep being in the workforce. So that would be number 2. And then number 3, housing. We're trying, but the progress is slow. And we've got a real issue with a structural undersupply of housing, which I think is a handbrake to lots of things. It's a handbrake to productivity. It's a handbrake to having a mobile labour force. It's a handbrake to aspiration. So they would be 3. I think if we could do those, almost the productivity story would look suddenly a whole lot better. So we know we talk a lot about wanting to do better on productivity, but I think if we sorted those 3 things out, we'd be a big part of the way there.
Angus Hannon from Next Transition Group. Thank you, Sally, for your time this afternoon. Not trying to give you a loaded question, but to your comment of a fractured world and a at home first, what would you have a comment on the EU trade deals that have gone on while the EU's been in town recently?
So I wouldn't say I'm an expert on those, but I do know enough to know that wasn't well received by the agricultural sector. So I think there was a sense that maybe we got some very, very small concessions, but in the scheme of things, they weren't weren't large. I think there are others in other parts of the economy, like the services industry, who were really happy with the way that trade deal landed. But this is, I think, increasingly going to be the world that we are living in, right, where we are going to have to do more of these bilateral trading agreements. And I suppose, I would hope that one is a starting point. So it's better possibly to have something rather than nothing. But I do sort of feel like, for agriculture, while that might have been a difficult outcome, I also feel for that industry, it's not the be-all and end-all, and I do think there is a world of opportunity for agriculture. And one of the things that I didn't mention when we were talking earlier about, like, what are the positives or the opportunities for Australia, like, another massive one for us is that we are sort of geographically positioned to the fastest growing region in the world, which is not China anymore because their population's shrinking. It's not Japan because theirs is shrinking. But it's effectively that Southeast Asian ring, all the way from Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, where the demographics, we think ours are good, theirs are unbelievably good. And so I think for agriculture, while the European thing might have been a bit of a disappointment, and it's clearly a big market, we also have a world of opportunity right on our doorstep. So.
Are there any more questions? Otherwise, the defender of the neoliberal world order is going to get a go. Justine.
Thanks, Rob. Justine Pari from Sec Newgate. You talked about how the neoliberal view doesn't really work anymore, the importance of bilateral trade, energy and manufacturing. So my question's about manufacturing. Where do you see that going for Australia? How much potential is there for manufacturing to actually come back on shore, and how important is that?
Yeah, so manufacturing has basically been very consistent in that if you look at it as a share of the economy, like, it's been one-way traffic, for decades now. And that was largely a function of globalisation, right? Like, you just specialised in the stuff you were good at. We weren't that good at it. It was high cost. There were others who could do it far more cheaply. So we pivoted to the stuff we were good at. So to a certain extent, probably can't get any worse for manufacturing. Like, there's just not that much of it left. I think it's not even 5% of the overall economy anymore. There are parts of it that we're really good at, and that tends to be very high-tech manufacturing. But there is a sense that, every country wants to bring more manufacturing capability back on shore, and we will do some of that here in Australia. It'll have to be, I suspect, driven by, various forms of government subsidies and intervention. But, there is a push to reindustrialise everywhere around the world. What it will mean is that we are no longer in that low inflation, low volatile inflation world. Like, if we're going to make things in a far less efficient way, so we're not going to do just-in-time supply or inventory management. We're not going to say, if you're Italian, you keep making the pasta, and if we're Swiss, we'll keep pumping out the watches and the chocolate. Like, we're not going to do that anymore. That's a less efficient way of organising resources across the world, and that will come at a cost, and the cost will be slower growth and probably stickier and higher inflation, and that will just be a natural output of this world where we all realise we can't rely on one another as much. So Future Made in Australia is a bit of that. Like, so there is an element to that initiative which is about manufacturing in certain parts of the economy to do with the transition towards clean energy. But so that might be one area. But I think there will be more manufacturing here in a decade than there was, 10 years ago.
Sally, Andrew Marshall from the Land newspaper. Just a quick query. We've got a federal budget coming up. How are we going to pay for all this stuff that you're proposing that we should spend, that the government should spend? And I would have thought, I know our debt is not necessarily as big as the UK or other countries, which is probably just as well, but aren't we spending an awful lot repaying interest on a debt that has blown out, particularly in places like Victoria and Queensland? And can we actually, with our current economy, pay for all this, especially given that we've got a May budget coming up fairly soon that we need to think about?
Yeah, so, you're right to observe that in some states, so Victoria and Queensland would be the main ones, their balance sheets are not as healthy as, you would probably otherwise like. The irony in all of this is that when you go and speak to investors sitting in Hong Kong, or other parts of the world, they say, oh, we love Queensland and Victorian debt because the market's big and it's liquid and we can get in and out. And but having said that, like and there's no easy way out of that for Victoria. Like they sort of were here before. Back in the 90s, they sold a lot of state assets to pay down the debt, but that's a one-shot game. You can only do that once. Once it's sold, it's gone. So they have a long and what will be at times hard road to hoe to get out of that. Here in Australia, I think what we have to do is we've got to get rid of the structural budget deficit. So we need to cut spending and we need to be quite brutal about this. So there are parts of the budget, so NDIS is probably the obvious one, but again, you're right to point out interest costs that are growing, too fast. And so there's I think a bit of it does feel like, over the last decade, and this was accelerated by COVID, that there is a bigger expectation on the part of the electorate that whenever something goes wrong, governments will just sort it out. Governments will just spend the money and sort it out. But I think increasingly people are now starting to say, well, that's actually not particularly sustainable, and if the only way we can fund that is through higher taxes, then I'm not sure I'm interested in that solution. The best way out of all of this would be to grow productivity growth, because that means you can run the economy at faster growth rates without worrying so much about inflation. And if we did that, then we'd generate more income, more ability to fund the things that we think are important. But that won't happen overnight. That's a long-term solution. So if we want to change that from 10 years, in 10 years' time, we've got to get started on that right now. So I think it really just requires, because they're the only options: cut spending, lift taxes, or do better on productivity growth. And so the third one, that's a long-term project. The other two we can do pretty much straight away. Hiking taxes is politically not very popular, but I think we just need to be far more brutal around the expenditure side of the budget, which is really blown out. Like, everyone's seen those charts of government spending as a percent of GDP in real and nominal terms, sitting basically at record highs, and we don't want that. So we're not like some other countries where there are genuine concerns about debt sustainability. We're a long, long way away from that, but that doesn't mean we should be complacent. We get, I wouldn't say a free ride, but we get an easier ride, because from an investor's perspective, these choices are all relative. So when you're looking at fiscal situations across the world and saying, well, whose credit risk do I want more, the Australian governments or the US governments or the UK governments, we stack up pretty well. So even though our fiscal situation has got worse in absolute terms, in relative terms, we still look pretty amazing. And we're one of like a handful of countries that still has a AAA credit rating from all three rating agencies. There's only a very small group of countries that can boast about that.